Released in 1977, the Atari VCS, or 2600 as it's sometimes known, is one of the all-time classic video game machines. The second generation console Titan was the first major step in being able to play something in the bar and then bring the experience home. I mean, who could pass up those classic brightly coloured boxes, fun arcade conversions, and those oh so memorable adverts? Well, most people you probably know. The launch price was around $850 in today's money, meaning you either rented it on a special occasion or your uncle's friend had one and you only got a look in when your parents thought you were asleep. The equivalent of the Sony PlayStation of its day, with a near control of the US market, the Atari had somewhere between 450 to 700 games, depending on who you ask, with every genre imaginable available to the player. Of course you have the classics like Space Invaders, Pong, Pitfall and Adventure, but with a library so vast and absolutely no quality control, like the Wild West of publishing, alongside the greats, it's not hard to find bizarre little gems such as Chase the Chuckwagon, the Purina dog food game, the A-Team, the game, Kool-Aid Man, and Tax Avoiders. I'm not kidding, go and look them up. Eventually breaking under its own weight, with insurmountable costs, oversupply of the market, unrealistic targets not being met, and famous heavy hitters such as Pac-Man and E.T. failing to deliver on their promises, the company went bust and hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of unsold stock and broken inventory was simply buried in the Alamogordo Desert, closing the curtains once and for all. However, the video game buzz didn't die with Atari. In the space of a few years, Nintendo would rise from the ashes and a certain plumber you may be familiar with kicked the industry back into action. Despite its initial downfall, the console lives on happily both in the memory of older players and the excitement of discovery of new ones. The console is still actively supported today with a thriving online community, new games coming out, ready accessibility at conventions, and plenty of compilation collections exist for modern consoles to get you started. The Atari, whether that be the Heavy Sixer, Vader, or Junior, offer a video game experience unlike no other. Once you've finished playing the classics, the next question is, what do I play? What's actually worth tracking down and giving a go? In no particular order, I have comprised a list of what I would actually choose to play and invest my time in with a few friends. Along the way, I'll put in some star picks, and if you enjoyed the video, I have another 20 or so titles I could easily pull together for a second outing. So viewer, let's begin with Stampede, developed by Activision in 1981. In this game, you take the role of a cowboy and have to round up the cattle that have bolted from your farm. You score points by A, staying alive as long as possible, and B, not allowing any cattle to move behind you. As you score more points, the cattle become faster and more agile. Considering the age of the game, there is a good sense of momentum and the gameplay hook is still engaging today, especially with children. The average price online is around £10, and I think that's about right for this kind of game. I think it's worth picking up if you find it at a convention, as it genuinely held my attention. Up next is a personal favourite of mine, Worm War 1, developed by Sirius Software in 1982. The game is a reimagining of Space Invaders, with the screen auto-scrolls up as the worms come down, leading to a much greater sense of urgency during gameplay. Along the way you can shoot the nests of the worm to score more points and refill your ship. The game is notable for its good control, vibrant use of colour, and strangely addicting gameplay. And yes, in case you were wondering, Worm War 1 is an abbreviation of World War 1.
Oh really?
The game is a bit harder to find in the UK, but should cost you no more than £20 once you've imported it from the US. I think this one is worth the investment, as it's one of those Atari games where everything goes boom, but has enough of a hook to keep you interested for longer than 5 minutes. One of the headlining acts for the Atari 2600 in retro collecting circles is Air Raid, by far the most expensive Atari game and one of the rarest video games of all time. Released in extremely limited quantities by Menavision in 1982, Air Raid has you defending the Earth in this Space Invaders style Earth defense game. The game itself isn't much to write home about, with dodgy controls and flickering, but the cartridge does feature this odd blue-shaped handle design and has been known to sell upwards of $30,000, putting it in the same novelty category as games like E.T., Chase the Chuckwagon, and Kool-Aid Man for being bizarre and just interesting. If you're looking for a solid two-player game to play, look no further than Frogs and Flies, developed by Mattel in 1982. In this game, you and a friend each take control of a hungry frog eyeing up their dinner in the local pond. The objective is to time your jump and tongue attack to the rhythm of the flies above in order to score points. If that sounds confusing, it's basically the game's swing shot in the 90s classic Gladiators. The gameplay is fast, addicting, and players, despite the graphics, can utilise a number of strategies to outfox their friends. This is the kind of game that looks very simple, but remains a sofa pleaser as everyone can get involved. Today you can find a copy for around £12. Speaking of easy to pick up and play games, Atari's 1978 rendition of Basketball is another surprisingly decent game for the system and is often played at conventions to get people to sit down and have a go. Whilst a very simple concept, the graphics do what they need to do and the gameplay and animation is a lot better than a lot of other titles on the system, with a pick up and play gameplay style that remains fun to this day. In my experience, Basketball is the perfect game to be shared between grandchildren and grandparents, and if either of those parties struggle with the Atari controller, you can always stick in 2 Sega Mega Drive controllers to make life easier. A copy today can be had for under £5 and is super common, so if you feel inclined to make a coffee table out of them, you absolutely could. Halo 2600 is one of the more popular games for the system in this list. Released in 2010 by Ed Fries, who was the former vice president of game publishing at Microsoft, the game is a demake of Halo Combat Evolved for the original Xbox and does a pretty good job of replicating Level 2 Halo from the original campaign. The game feels most similar to a title like Berserk, as you travel around the map blasting grunts and elites and features a total of 64 screens. The game plays in original hardware, so if you can find a copy online or get one made via Etsy, you can play a new, old Atari game on your console. A prime example of a game taking full advantage of the system is Enduro by Activision from 1983. The game is, believe it or not, a racing style game in the same vein as Sega's Hang On or Outrun. As the driver, it's up to you to pass as many other races as possible, moving through a full day to make it to the end of the event. What impresses me most about this game is the sense of speed, especially as you put your foot down, and clever effects like using fog to change how you approach the race and your visibility is cut off as you make it into the early morning. Enduro can be had for around £12 boxed and complete and is absolutely worth your time. If you're looking for a good arcade conversion, then look no further than Frogger, released in 1982 by Parker Brothers. A staple of retro game conventions, Frogger challenged you to cross the road and the infested waters to get home, with the objective to get all the frogs home at the gates at the top of the screen. Despite the limited graphics and sound, the core of the game is solid and remains fun today. Frogger is a great game to play with older relatives, or just to waste 10 minutes with your spouse while you wait for someone to arrive. Today you can find a copy for around £15 in good condition, and it's worth considering for your collection. Here's a fun one. This is Pepsi Invaders, sometimes known as Coke Wins. Developed by Atari for the Coca-Cola Company in 1983 as a non-commercial release. The game, as you might imagine, is a parody of Space Invaders, where you literally destroy your cola rival. The trick here though is that you have unlimited lives and cannot lose, making this game far easier to pick up and play than the original game. I feel that the controls are slightly better too than the source material, so when it comes to Space Invader action, especially with a theme, this is often my go-to pick. Today, the game sits in the holy grail of Atari games category, so you're likely going to need someone to make one for you on Etsy, or buy something like a flash cartridge to play at home, unless you have upwards of £2,000 to spend. Skiing by Activision in 1980 is another solid game for the system. In this game, you are making your way down the mountain as fast as possible, scoring points by hitting gates along the way. This game has a good use of colour, scrolls smoothly, and actually looks like the sport it's trying to represent, which, believe it or not, is a rarity for this system. It might look simple, but the game is good fun to play with a group of friends, especially as you compete for the fastest time possible. A copy can be had for around £10. In keeping with the winter theme, this is Frostbite, developed again by Activision and released in 1983. The objective of the game is to match all of the tiles in the play area to build the igloo at the top of the screen. Much like Qbert, you move at an isometric angle, and the further you get into the game, the faster the platforms and enemies become. It's a humble game, but it's still lots of fun and can be found for around £20 to £30 and makes an ideal game to play with younger members of the family in social settings. Believe it or not, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre appears in the Atari 2600 and is famous for being one of the first horror video games ever made. Developed by Wizard Video Games in 1983, in this game you take control of Leatherface and have to hunt down and kill all of the women who have escaped into the forest. The game makes good use of sound for the chainsaw, offers blood, and features a humorous plot twist at the end of the round, when the women get their own back by literally kicking your butt off the stage and resetting the system. At the time of its release, many shops refused to sell the game, and much like the Mystique series of Atari porn games, has become highly collectible in today's market, even if it does just look like Tinky Winky getting stuck on bits of litter of Foxhole car boot sale. Despite being simple, somewhat repetitive, and lending itself to callous fun, you're going to need upwards of £1,000 to snag a copy if you want the authentic experience at home. Here's Shootin' Gallery by iMagic. Atari Age isn't quite sure about the release of this one, but it follows in a similar theme to Atari's own Carnival, placing it around the early 80s. In this game, you play the role of a teenager shooting carnival targets for points. Whilst the game looks incredibly simple, the shooting action here is solid, and the Atari 2600 does a great job of recreating the song Entry of the Gladiators, despite the game being comparatively microscopic in size to modern games. The game is somewhat rare today and will set you back around £40, but I think it's worth it if you're building a games collection of games to actually play, rather than just look at. Hero by Activision in 1984 is a cult classic and deserves a mention here. In this game, you play the role of a rescue operative who dons a helicopter backpack to explore Mount Leone and save the trapped workers. Using your dynamite to clear walls and your blast to defeat wildlife, you have a limited amount of oxygen to move around the stages and rescue the people inside. The deeper inside you go the mountain, the more hazards you'll find, and you'll need to use strategies like using dynamite to temporarily light the room to find your way. The game can be had for around £60 today and commands its price for good reason. Another strange game is Red Sea Crossing, which to my knowledge is the only example of a Bible-themed game for the system. In this game, you play as Moses attempting to cross the Red Sea. Along the way, you have to dodge all manner of hazards and environment changes, and it's kind of like a Super Mario Bros. Hybrid, where you also have to try and score as much as possible. The game doesn't look like much, but the platforming is decent, and the theme makes it an interesting oddity that you're likely going to sit down and play for at least 20 minutes. The game is famous for being an Atari title the community wasn't sure actually existed outside of an obscure magazine reference, but lo and behold, here it is. This is the type of game you're only going to find at conventions or museums, so it's worth a shot while you're there. River Raid is a prime example of a game done right and is a must-have for the system. Released by Activision in 1982, the game is notable for not only being created by Carol Shaw, one of the first female video game designers, but also for selling over 1 million copies worldwide. The objective of the game is to pilot your jet fighter and blast open the gates of the valley and destroy the enemy armor that lurks inside. Along the way you collect fuel canisters to resupply your jet, and the goal here is to stay alive whilst going on the offensive for as long as possible. The graphics are good, the animation of your jet is clever, and the gameplay has a great hook to it. A copy can be had for under £20 and it's an absolute no-brainer. Haunted House is another game that immediately springs to mind of having value. Released in 1982 by Atari themselves, the game is notable for being one of the very first survival horror games. The goal is to navigate the house of the late Zachary Graves and recover 3 pieces of an urn. The player is represented simply by a pair of eyes and must avoid all of the cliché ghoulies that lurk within, like ghosts and spiders. However, the further the player gets into the game, the less visibility you have. Midway through the game, you have to use a candle, which does make your hero look like Eric Cartman dressed as a cheesy poof, which to be honest is quite funny, but when the lights truly go out, you do actually get the feeling of not wanting to venture too far in fear of something jumping out and killing you. This one is worth checking out, and uses Atari's minimal graphics to its benefit. A copy can be had for around £10. Sequest is another personal favourite of mine, developed by Activision in 1983 by Steve Cartwright, the developer of Frostbite. In this game, you take control of a submarine and must navigate the ocean floor while blasting away the marine life and scoring points by rescuing people who have plunged into the icy depths. In essence, the game feels like the Mac game Feeding Frenzy, just this time with guns. The graphics are solid, the controls are tight and responsive, and the oxygen meter adds another layer of challenge that doesn't feel bolted on or prohibitive. A copy can be had for around £16 today and is one of my all-time favourites for the system, and even had its own advert. Check this out.
I think I hear your tiny divers calling out to you. Help! Help! Sequest. Steve Cartwright does it again for Activision.
Up next is Montezuma's Revenge, released in 1984 by Parker Brothers. This game is an early example of a Metroidvania game, with you moving around a map, collecting treasure, dodging enemies, and doing your best to stay alive as long as possible. The gameplay is solid, the graphics are good, the platforming is tight, and I like that the game actually makes you slow down and plan your next move. If you enjoy games like Pitfall, this is a really good alternative for around £50. And finally, here's Atlantis, developed by iMagic in 1982. In this futuristic Earth defense style game, you take control of 3 cannons around the playfield and use different actions on the controller to fire with each one. The objective of the game is to protect the underwater city at the bottom of the screen from the increasingly aggressive Martian forces. Whilst the game is a solid entry into the library, it's famous for having an ultra-rare sequel with faster gameplay and an updated scoring system that was given away as part of a special contest in Bermuda. The game can easily be found online for £6 and is a must-have. So those are my picks for my Atari 2600 Grand Tour. If you have any suggestions or memories you'd like to share, please drop them in the comments below. I actively play my 2600 and I would love to find some more games out there that I haven't heard of yet to my collection. If you're interested in learning more, I highly recommend the book The Art of Atari by Tim Lapatino, which features a complete history of the console with high quality scans of each artwork for the games, design documents, and interviews with the developers. Or, if you're more of a McDonald's and documentary type of person, I highly recommend the docu-series Once Upon Atari, directed and produced by Howard Scott Warshaw, the man that created the legendary Yars' Revenge, Raiders of the Lost Ark, and everyone's favourite, E.T. Also, if you're feeling inspired and have a copy of Call of Duty World War II knocking around, by visiting the multiplayer hub and travelling to this area, you can actually access a lot of these titles already via emulation, as Activision chose to include them as an Easter egg in the game. Hey! Thanks for tuning in to this episode of SnapbackWill. As always, I'd like to thank all of the lovely people on screen now for their contributions to the production of this video. Next time we'll be taking a look at 10 standout games, plus a few extras that aren't Mario, Zelda, or Pokemon for the Nintendo Game Boy Advance. See you there!